chat. There's Phil. Welcome, Phil. Good to have you on board. I was just telling everyone I've been having some fun with the IT here. So I'll share my screen. There we go. There. That other way. Oh, I don't want that up there. Sorry about this. This is all normally done in advance. So let's bring that back. Okie doke. So welcome to week 11. This week we're going to talk about breaking bad habits, sustaining good habits. Now, ultimately, there's a piece of research that came out from Duke University that estimated that habits shape at least 45% of our lives. And so when we're looking at the subject of performance, when we're looking at how we show up every day, well, that's 50% of what we do every day. It has a very big impact onto our performance. Now, there's actually some other research out there that says that our thoughts, so the thoughts that we have today, 95% of them are the same as what we had yesterday. And so there's some contradiction in the research, but it says that at least 45% of what we do and what we think is habitual. And so ultimately, when we're looking at habits, we're looking at, okay, well, what makes a habit? What actually goes into creating a habit, both good and bad, and how can we use that knowledge to be able to have a higher level of performance, be able to achieve more of the things that make an impact for us in our lives, achieve more of the things that we're wanting to do, like train for a marathon, for instance, or the other things that we're wanting to do. So again, I know some of you are wanting to have greater health and vitality. And then to give you an example of how I've used this tool, there was a point probably about 4 years ago where I was running a sales team. And those people would come to me and they'd often have questions where, Matt, how do I do this? How do I do that? Etc. And I kind of became a bottleneck of the knowledge within that team. And I had to actually reprogram the way that I was dealing with those, because if we break it down, and I'll dive into what a habit is and how it works, but ultimately the trigger was that they asked me that question of how do I do this? My routine was I very simply answered it. And my reward out of that is something along the lines of I get my time back. Like, it's a quick way to get me out of what was going on and back to my important work, or even some significance. So again, I've helped them. Again, I'm the knowledgeable person, etc. And so it would maybe feed a little bit of my pride. But when I was able to diagnose that, the challenge that was going on for me was actually that I was becoming a bottleneck. So actually the team were needing to come to me for everything. And I had to, in effect, step in and start building a habit where I wouldn't answer the question straight away. I'd actually ask them, okay, well, where would you find that information? Or have we covered that before? How would you do it? But I had to actually change my hats from being the answer and providing the answer to ultimately my new behavior, which was that of a coach, of going, well, I know they have the tools, I know they have the resources, I know they have the knowledge. They're just coming to me for some reason. And currently my routine in that is not helping them, and it's not helping me to achieve a higher level of performance. So that's an example of a habitual behavior that's quite common in the workplace, where people will think it's just quicker to get this off my my desk now if I just help them really quickly, or if I keep doing this myself. My habit is that no one else can do it as well as me, so I'll keep doing it myself, etc. So we have habitual behaviors that are potentially holding us back. And so ultimately what we're going to look at tonight is what makes a habit, and then how we can reprogram those to be what we want. And so there's basically three parts of a habit, and I've kind of alluded to it a little bit there. There's a trigger, there's an event. So for instance, and I've talked about this before, in the past, if I'm really tired if my sort of physical energy is low, that's likely to be the time when I will eat food that is not good for me. So for instance, if I'm in the city all day, I've had meetings all morning, I've been back to back with sort of research interviews, etc. I'm cognitively drained, and it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon and I've skipped lunch, I haven't had the chance to sort of fuel. That is the point that I know I am at my weakest for the food I'll choose to eat. I'm wanting a bit of comfort in my body. I'm wanting a bit of ability to relax, etc. So I'll make a choice that isn't necessarily the best for me. So that's the trigger. The trigger for me around not eating the best food is I'm tired. I realize I'm tired. And then I therefore have a routine, which is seek out something that will give me comfort in my body. And so that's the routine where you find that sort of food. And then the reward is, well, I feel comfort. I feel satiated. I feel a bit more rejuvenated, perhaps from such a busy routine. And that's the cycle. And so, again, these things happen all through our day in everything that we do. So another example is you get out of bed and hopefully, Gil, with your running shoes are already there. So the trigger is they're there and I go for my run now. If they're not there, then again, the trigger to remind you to do it might not be present. And again, you might miss that opportunity of when you run. So hope that might be in the morning, who knows, when you decide to run. And then ultimately that triggers the behavior. So the action item to take out of that loop is you need to figure your trigger. And ultimately, if it's a habit that you want to reprogram, you need to ultimately work out, well, what is the trigger? What's going on there? And then you need to replace it with a new, better routine that keeps the same reward. So if we give an example of why people smoke, I mean, the research shows that smoking is really bad for you. Like everybody knows it, yet people still smoke, etc. And ultimately, you can look at the behavior of why people will still do something that common sense, science, everything says is bad for them. And it ultimately links to a trigger that usually relates to 2 areas. It's either stress or boredom. For most bad habits, it usually comes from stress and boredom. And so, for instance, even the use of Facebook is I'm usually probably a bit stressed or I'm a bit bored and I'll go on a social media binge in order to give myself that reward of feeling better, feeling not stressed, not bored, etc. Smoking is the same example. Usually what happens, and again, I've done work with people to help them stop smoking in the past. I'm actually a master practitioner in hypnosis and a few other things as well. It's not really what I do now, but I have helped a lot of people stop smoking, for instance. And so when you look at that addictive behavior, what's actually happening is usually their routine is that they're, say at work, they've been a bit stressed for a while. They realize they're a bit stressed. They have some colleagues that are going out to have a smoke or whatever as well. And so they'll go with them. And it gives them a break away from their desk. It gives them a break away from their work. So it's a de-stress. And also, it's if their work has been sort of boring, it's a bit of social contact. It's a bit of team bonding, like a bit of camaraderie, etc. And so ultimately, the reward is such, the brain goes, well, hang on, okay, I'm stressed, I'm bored, I'm feeling a bit tired. I'll go for a smoke, even though I know it's not good for me, because I get all of these other positive benefits. And so that's where habits come. And ultimately, you can use this for positive intent, but also just knowing that these things, that if you have some bad habits in your life, you have the ability to reprogram them, because actually all it is to do with the wiring that you have in your head, and knowing that actually there's a trigger, there's a reward, and all you need to do is change what happens in the middle. So let's get tactical and pick some habits. So what I'd like you to think about is work for a moment. What is a new habit in the next 30 days you'd like to build a bit more of? And so that might be, I used a coaching example, for instance, and I know some of you are building a team. So again, it might be something in that ilk. Otherwise, it's around your profile and doing some things that are going to raise your profile. Maybe it's something else for you. Again, you can look at what we did in our one-on-one, and I know with everybody recently, there's some new stuff, some growth stuff happening for you around our recent one-on-ones. So maybe pick something there. But what is a new habit that you'd like to do more of in the next 30 days that would actually give you a positive impact to your performance, to yourself and work? And I'm just going to bring up the chat client. There we go. So once you've got that, I'd love to just see what you'd like to do more of at work. What's a habit, a behavior that you think would have a positive impact to your role, to your team, to your performance, to your income, etc. But what's a new thing that you'd like to do in a work context? So we've got Titan as to take breaks more often. Fantastic. I've been speaking with a few people about those recently, and yeah, just getting the body up, moving, getting it energized, getting that release. It's great for our metabolism, but also for our mental performance. So awesome. And what else, guys? What else are maybe a new behavior that you wanted to do? And then what is something you'd like to reprogram? And I use this word reprogram as opposed to bad habits. And the reason is reprogram shows that we're growing, shows that we're moving forward. And if you continue to label things as a bad habit, we all make, whenever we are on the journey of improving habits, there will be points when you muck up. There'll be points where you don't get it perfect. We are human. We're human beings, and we're therefore fallible. And ultimately, when you say that you're doing something that's bad, that's actually not good for your self-esteem, for your morale, etc. And so that's why I use the word reprogram, because all you're doing is giving yourself that ability to continually iterate better, to continually become better, and not get caught up in the moments when you fail. When we look at food, for instance, there's a lot of people that eat based on emotion, and with that, they'll perhaps go. I'm back again. Sorry about that. Seems that my internet is still causing a bit of a difficulty. So you can all hear me, yes? You're nodding head? Awesome. Thank you. So I'll just share the screen again. The joys of regional IINet. There we go. So, yes, I'll be talking about emotional eating. And ultimately, people will get to a point, they'll be triggered, it'll just fire off, and they'll go and get themselves some chocolate cake, for instance. But then partway through, they'll realize that they're doing this habit that they don't want to do anymore. But then they'll keep eating. And they're like, oh, just screw it. I'm just going to give in, and I'm going to not even just eat the slice. I'm going to eat the whole cake. Or I'm going to have the cake plus the ice cream plus everything else. And this is common when people get to this point of, I've failed, I've mucked up here. And the word reprogramming goes and shows that it's actually about building it over time. So knowing that you will have those moments where something will have happened, the old programming might have fired off, and that's all right. It's about consistency, not perfection. So that's why we use the word reprogram. So what's a work habit that you might like to reprogram, for instance? So, oh yeah, sorry, we've got either, I was just reading Titan's comment, either that or he's really good at being still. So I take it you could see a frozen image of me. Love it. So what's a work thing that you would like to reprogram? So for instance, what's a good example? An example, again, in my work life was there were some people I worked in quite a political environment in my last role, and there were some people that were very, how to put it nicely, they were very into the rules of the way that things should be done. And therefore we'd come to meetings and I'd have ideas, that's my nature, and they're like, oh no, that's not how we can do it. No, we can't do it that way. It's not the way that we do it, da da da. And they would just shoot down ideas all the time. And so therefore I was triggered to not come to those meetings believing that we could get to a positive outcome, believing that they would support my ideas. I just believed that they would shoot them down. And so I got into a bit of a pattern of, oh, okay, I'll just be quiet in this meeting. I don't need to do anything here, etc. And what I had to do was actually reprogram that belief, because it wasn't supporting the company. It wasn't supporting me getting more projects through and sort of new innovations in our products and services. And actually, I had to go and try and understand their model of the world. Like, why was this so important for them? And so actually, instead of just going, oh, it's broken, it's not working, I won't try anymore, I had to get them to start talking about, well, why do they always go, oh, we can't do that? And actually it related to a lot that they've been burned in the past, where things had just gone through too fast, people weren't involved, etc. But the habit that I had to build there was actually looking at them and going, okay, well, in their model of the world, why is this stuff important to them? Like, why are they putting the brakes on me being able to drive things that should grow our business? And it was ultimately that they'd been burned in the past, and they wanted to feel involved in the process, and they just needed a bit more time, a bit more information, etc., in order to be able to come along on that journey with me. So, work reprogram. We can see something needs fixing first, listen, ask, understand viewpoint, and several others, incorporate that into my response. Awesome. So you now have a new consistent behavior that you'd like to take forward. And then you just do the same two things. What's a new thing that you'd like to do in your life? So again, is there something in your health that you want to do? Do you want to finally learn to play the guitar? What is it that would be a life thing for yourself? And then a life thing that you want to reprogram. And again, I do this regularly. There's always behaviors that I'm like, oh, I could be better at that. Like I've got little kids, and a behavior that I would choose to reprogram is to be fully present with them when I am with them. And as I am an author and I do a lot in research, I'm up in my head a lot of the day. That is something that I am actively working on at the moment, because they love the attention when I can give it them. They love when I'm fully present. But I miss their lives if I'm not. And so, yeah, there's various things, and I'll share how we do it as we go. But what are a few things that you either want to reprogram or that you want to do that's new? And then in a moment, I'm going to run through some of the research. There's ultimately 23 ways to either build a rock solid habit or how to reprogram habits that have been holding us back. And so I've got that as a tactical breakdown at the very end, but we're going to run through some of the research to help you really unlock how some of this stuff works. And so ultimately, you've got hopefully 4 habits, 4 things that you're thinking about, a new habit. And what I want you to be doing when we're going through this research is going, actually, well, how would that apply to what I'm doing here? How would that apply now? And so the first thing I want to talk about is the domino effect, which is a bit like the compound effect that I talked about in the last training. The domino effect is basically, researchers worked out that a domino, when it's falling, has enough momentum to actually knock down a domino that is 1.5 times its size. And so what actually happens is that with that multiplication of each one 1.5 times, 1.5 times, the next one 1.5 times, etc., after just 23 dominoes, it can knock down one as high as the Eiffel Tower. And after just 57, that's the same as from the Earth to the moon in distance. And so after 57 moves, it's had that multiplication effect. And that applies to our lives in two ways. One is the fact that each month, if you picked a new habit and you did that for 30 days and you built that as a regular new habit, and then you built another one, well, that compounding effect to your life, that's 12 new habits in a year that you've built that ultimately have a massive result. But even also for the habits that you have built, they have a compounding effect on themselves. They take more momentum into the other things that you do. And so ultimately that's where, when I talk about it's 50% or 45% as a minimum of your behavior every day, this domino effect has a massive effect into how you live your life, how you show up every day. One of the things that's been shown to help people unlock and reprogram their habits is actually to take a stance of mindfulness. And so when a habit comes up, a lot of people will think, oh, I'll just grit and willpower this new habit into existence, and I'll break my old habits, etc. Actually, that's been scientifically proven to not be successful. I've talked before about willpower having a finite amount of a tank, and that you want to conserve that as much as possible. What it actually requires is a bit of being a detective, and then actually adding a new routine into that old behavior. But it's a bit like if in the example of smoking, there's a research study that was done that used mindfulness as a way to help people stop smoking. So traditional stop smoking methods would be patches, maybe hypnosis, etc. Mindfulness was shown to be twice as effective as standard smoking cessation practices. Because what they would do is they would get someone to ask, well, why do I feel like I want this cigarette now? And how does the cigarette taste when I'm having it? And various other questions, but particularly the one where it was like, well, it feels like I'm inhaling chemicals. It switched them on. So it wasn't just something that I'm talking to someone while I'm smoking a cigarette. They're actually noticing what the experience is like. Or the same thing with eating chocolate cake, for instance. Well, I might feel good in the moment, but then about 15 minutes later, I feel heavy and sluggish and so forth. And so the mindfulness is a really great way of being able to help you unlock it and see what's actually going on. And you're almost stepping into that stance of being a mini detective. Then you have ultimately BJ Fogg, and he wrote and has a blog called Tiny Habits. Now, he does a lot of research into how to get people to be addicted to their devices. He deals with that at the Stanford University. But one of the things that he has worked out is you want to be able, if you're going to start doing a new habit, so for instance, you're going to start, you want to floss your teeth as an example. You want to break it down into something as small as possible in order to increase your likelihood of doing it. And so he would say, if you wanted to floss your teeth, well, just floss one, just start flossing one. And that's the new habit, because once you've started, you're quite likely to finish the rest of them. Or if you want to be a bit healthier and you want to do like 100 push-ups a day, for instance, well, just get out of bed and do one. And then you're likely to do 10 or however many you can fit in the morning. But you start really small. Say, for instance, you want to build a prayer or a mindfulness practice, like a meditation practice, for instance. Well, you do it for a minute, but then, and you have a particular cushion or chair you sit on, etc. But then you ultimately build it that it's likely to go longer than that minute. But you're just saying, well, the habit, I want to be able to do it really quickly, really easily. So you work out what that minimum effective dose, that micro habit would be, and how you can break that bigger chunk down into something that you can execute in less than 60 seconds. Then you have people like Dan Coyle, who authored the book The Talent Code, which is an excellent book. But he particularly looked at why, for instance, Russian tennis players or gymnasts were better than everybody else, like why they could just go and absolutely smash particularly female tennis players, the rest of the population. And what he realized, and I've talked about this before, about myelin on our neural pathways, but he talked about deep practice. and that these people are ultimately breaking down the habits into their constituent parts. And so if they wanted to build a new habit, you basically broke it down into individual pieces. So for instance, if you wanted to get really good at acing a tennis serve, you would actually not do the whole serve. You deconstruct, for instance, just throwing the ball up in the air and doing that really, really well. And that muscle memory that you then stack into the next thing after that. So for instance, the way that you would arch your arm around the wall. How that plays out in work, if you look at, say, again, a coaching example with your sales team, it's the same thing. It's ultimately, well, what are some new things I need to start doing? And so the first part could be, okay, well, have I asked them? Have they reviewed other information? So like, where else could they find that other than just me? And then if that question is one piece, and get in a regular habit of saying that. And then after that, well, what's the next thing? Okay, well, how could you solve that question yourself? Like, what could you do going forward? And you're ultimately helping them see how they can solve their own challenge, for instance. And so you're breaking it down into constituent parts and just getting better and better at firing off those particular pieces. And that ultimately becomes easier and easier as the myelin gets laid down in your head. Then the last two pieces is, if you've ever read the book, The Checklist Manifesto, it's a really great book, but ultimately it just says that checklists are required for success. They get used by doctors and nurses and ICU, etc. And they're really great at doing two things. You basically help you to either do and confirm that you've done them, or you read it, then you do it. And so how this plays out in habits is checklists are a really easy way of tracking whether you are achieving this habit over time. So for instance, I'll send to the Facebook group after this session a very simple 31-day habit tracker. But ultimately, what you want with this checklist is you put the habits that you're wanting to build or reprogram down at the left-hand column. And then you basically check off each day. Now, you can have a printed version of this. You can have it on your PC, whichever you prefer. But ultimately, you track it over time. And what you want is to never miss more than 2 days, because it's actually about consistency. And so I've said earlier, there will be points when you fail, and that's fine. Just get back on the horse again. And so this checklist is a really simple way to make sure that you're firing the things that are actually meaningful and important to you. So for instance, when I was building a regular gratitude practice, well, I'd have my morning and evening gratitude on there. So I talked about this as a habit that I have, or appreciation, like what am I looking forward to in the day ahead? Again, on the tracker, I had that question, and had I done it for the day? And so again, work habits and so forth. Well, am I getting up and moving regularly, Titan? Again, you'd have that on there, and you'd just be tracking that, yes, you're doing it. Now, there's another way to add checklists. So this is like for a whole day. But actually, you can also just stick a Post-it note on your computer screen. And again, if you're doing an 8-hour day, you'd want to have 8 ticks on there that you've got up and moved around 8 times. So it's called a visual cue. The idea of a visual cue actually came from someone that used something called the paperclip system. They had to do 120 cold calls a day. So they had 120 paperclips in one jar and an empty jar on the other side. And for every call they made, they just moved the paperclip across to the other jar. And so I've given you a 31-day tracker. It looks at the whole day. But if you have habits that are not just did it happen today, then you'd want some other ways of being able to measure those. So as I said, a simple Post-it note that you check off on your desk or something like that. Again, if you want to drink more water, those sorts of things are really good at going, okay, well, am I doing this behavior? And a checklist is a very simple, very powerful way, particularly when you add visual cues to it. And then we just need to look at rewards briefly at the moment. So we've looked at that you have a trigger, something happens. You have then the routine, and we're going to help you give you some strategies about how to reprogram that. But also the reward at the end, there's ultimately only ever 3 rewards. And this is based on, again, a book called Hooked. But it's ultimately that the reward is either based on the tribe, the hunt, or the self. So the tribe is, it makes it feel accepted. So the example of smoking, for instance, if you think about when teens start to smoke, and it was ultimately being seen as sort of being cool or doing what the other teens do. And again, same with teenage drinking or other things. It's to do with social and belonging. So ultimately, a big part of what we do, a lot of the habits and behaviors that we do, is about wanting to belong to a tribe. But if you're trying to reprogram a new habit, a reward could be that you're ultimately picking picking the people that you want to connect with, the network that you want to have, really carefully. So if you want to be able to attract more wealth into your life, then again, you would hang around with people that are perhaps more wealthy, and that will, over time, raise your perception of what wealth looks like and how those people conduct their lives and so forth. Sorry, I completely lost my brain thought then. So the hunt, rewards, basically, it's ultimately we're looking for something more in our life. So that's the new gym gear. Like, you've been going to the gym, you've got some new gym gear in your life. You want the new boat, so you've got you're saving up for the new boat so you can do some sailing. And then ultimately the self, it's ultimately that you've gained some level of self-mastery and you're feeling like you've grown in some way. So they're the 3 rewards that we get when we ultimately look at new behaviors. This checklist is probably the best tool that I've ever come across for you to be able to audit what's actually going on. So if you want to be able to change a habit, and we've looked at the 3 things, so the cue, the reward, the routine. This is based out of The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. Now, I'm not going to deep dive too much into this checklist because actually it's really simple. It gives you on the left-hand side a few questions around, well, what's actually going on here? So when I talked about being the detective, well, what time is it? Where are you? Who else is around? So what things are happening that are triggering you? Now, the one question that kind of misses off there, he kind of gets it with the emotion and that you're feeling, is also, what's your energy level? Because particularly bad habits tend to fire off when we're stressed or bored or tired. So ultimately, that's what I would ask is, if your energy level is low, it's likely that your reptilian brain or your mammalian brain is going to fire off and either need something that is going to keep you safe and make you feel secure, or it's going to need some distraction in order to be like that dog looking for a bit of fun and a bit of play. And then it ultimately looks at the reward, but also how you can reprogram a new routine that still brings you to the last reward. So the reward might be, in the example of smoking, the reward is it's a breakaway from your desk. Like, it's a bit of time with some other colleagues, and it's a de-stress, it's a decompression from that experience. So there's other ways you could get that same reward. You could go to the coffee area and make yourself a drink and have a chat with anybody else. Or you could just go for a walk around the block, get some fresh air. Same thing as smoking. You're just not breathing in any smoke while you're taking some deep breaths and walking around the block. And so you can still achieve the same reward. You could grab your colleague and just go for a quick walking meeting, but actually still getting a bit of social impact and the other things that are going on for you for the reward. And then, so the routine is this new behavior. So the trigger happens, I'm stressed, I'm tired. The routine is, okay, well, what would the new routine need to look like in order to still give you the same reward? You see, even bad habits that you want to change, they're there because they're feeding some part of a need that you have at the time. So once you can understand what that need is, and so we're talking about rewards, that might be that you want to decompress, de-stress, etc. Ultimately, it'll give you that ability to be able to still achieve the reward, but with a better behavior. So these are the 23 ways I mentioned to reprogram your habit. Firstly, you need to understand what triggers the bad habit. Then you want to look at, ideally, if you can also stack habits. Now, we didn't touch on this earlier, but you get up in the morning. You have certain things you do every day. And so, for instance, I talked about last week morning and evening routines, because they're the two areas of your day that you are very in control of. Habit stacking is where you would look at something, a behavior you already have. So you're making yourself a coffee, for instance, and if it's like mine, it's a fresh plunger, takes about 4 minutes to brew. So ultimately, you've got 4 minutes there. You could do some meditation. Like if you wanted to do something, it's a behavior that's already running. I have a coffee most mornings, and so I know that I have this small window. But habit stacking is looking at things that you already are doing, and then just sandwiching some things either in the middle or before or after. So the coffee is in the middle. Other examples at work would be, if you want to get a bit more exercise, for instance, well, every time that you print something, you've got your printer copier, go for a walk around the whole of the office to get there, or up and down the stairs or whatever. So the habit is already happening. All you're doing is stacking another behavior so that it triggers you. So that's the new trigger. The habit that's already happening is the trigger, and you're just putting a new little cycle in there of something else you're wanting to do. So if you were to think about, for instance, Titan moving a bit more and getting a bit more, taking a few more breaks, well, how often do you need to print something? Or how often do you want to be drinking a glass of water, or just getting a little snack or something like that? Every time you're doing some form of a fuel, even just going to the bathroom, could you add a bit more movement into that routine? So a walk around your house, up and down your stairs 3 times before you then go and get yourself a glass of water or a drink, etc. And so you can build these habits, and habit stacking is probably one of the quickest wins you can have with trying to implement a new behavior. Some people say you should only focus on one new habit at a time, or reprogramming one habit at a time. I tend to disagree, and it's based on a lot of research, but basically it depends on how complex the behavior is. If you are an alcoholic addicted to alcohol, then yes, that's quite a potentially a challenging behavior to reprogram. But if you just want to get a bit more exercise, then that's actually not that hard. You just need to build in triggers that actually bring that into your day. If you want to be able to have better connection with your wife or your kids, which I mentioned, for instance, my kids is one of them. Every time that I walk into my living room, there is a picture of my kids that I see as soon as I walk out of my door. that trigger of the sight reminds me, hang on, I'm not in my office right now, so therefore I want to be able to connect with them, and even if that's just for 5 minutes, etc. So ultimately, the triggers are there so that we can have that new behavior. A very popular way of building new things is then to commit to it for 30 days. So that's why I've given you a habit tracker, but even trying to turn it into a challenge. So for instance, people, if you've ever wanted to write a book, November is a great month for that, because they have a whole month internationally, which is the National Writing Month. Like it's a 50,000 word book at 1,600 words a day. You'll write it in a month. So if you ever wanted to write a book, you can be part of that challenge. But same thing, if you wanted to be better at photography, commit to taking a photo a day. And in 30 days, it's amazing how much better you can become at something. And so how could you use the idea of a challenge, making it a bit of a game, but making it something that you're just doing for the next 30 days? How much more could you achieve in your life? And so again, I know Gil's got the marathon coming up. That's a great example. Like you can do a lot, like maybe not get ready for a marathon, but you probably get ready for a 10K in a month. You could go from having not really run a whole lot to getting ready to get through a 10K or even a 5K, but it's whatever that level based on your current fitness is. And then committing to, okay, that's my focus for 30 days and really getting through it. It's great if it's a daily practice. If it's a weekly practice, you need some form of reminder to help you make sure that it's happening. So again, if you're going to do a weekly review, you'd want it in your calendar so that it's telling you to do it. Because if it's not happening every day, you're probably not thinking about it often enough to make it a really consistent habit. So yeah, make it daily. We've mentioned checklists and never miss more than 2 days. So you're ultimately getting straight back on the bandwagon. Start simple. And so this fits with the tiny habits, but there's also examples where if you wanted to learn the guitar, and this is based on Sean Akers' research, and it's the 20-second rule. Ultimately, he put his guitar in his living room because it meant he could pick it up within 20 seconds. So I want to play guitar more, I want to learn to play guitar, etc. Oh, okay, I'll make it easier. His example also is if you wanted to break a behavior, make it harder to execute. So for instance, he wanted to watch less TV, so he took the batteries out of his remote and put them elsewhere in his house, which meant it took him longer than 20 seconds to do it. And so that habit didn't happen. An example of how that also would work is if you wanted to eat better food, well, don't have crappy food in your house. It's like, if it's not easy for you to fire, if you want to give up smoking, well, you want to get rid of all of your smoking paraphernalia and just not have it around you. So start simple actually is a really effective strategy for either creating new habits, making it really accessible. And again, particularly if it's a small habit, like just floss one tooth, both of those fit really well together. Then you want to remind yourself. And so I've talked about visual cues. I've talked about having a checklist, or ultimately having the paperclip system or Post-it notes, but things around you that will cue you. So I've talked about the photo, for instance, that I see that reminds me to connect with my kids. Otherwise, it's time, space, and sound. So, for instance, it's a certain time of the day and an alarm goes off reminding you to get up. So again, if you want to exercise regularly, and I have this on my phone, if you want to move regularly, every 90 minutes, every 60 to 90 minutes, I have an alarm that goes off that says, Matt, time to move. You've sat here for too long. And so I use time spacing to be able to remind myself to get up, to move around, etc. And then certain spaces. So again, my office is my work space. I only really come in here to work. It means then I'm primed to do that activity, but then it also means that I don't, when I go into my home, I don't hopefully take that that energy into that space. And then sound. If I want to have connection with Rosie, I just put on the song that we got married to. And that's the stuff. So again, there's lots of ways to remind yourself about what you want, and ultimately visual cues, time, space, or sound are the four main ways to do that. Stay consistent. So again, never miss more than 2 days, but do know that you'll have some challenges. If-then rules. So if you, for instance, wanted to you wanted to drink less, and it's Friday and your colleagues are all going out, if-then rules are basically saying that if someone offers you a beer, then I'll say, no, I prefer to have a glass of water. And so if-then rules, because you've pre-decided, you're more likely to fire off this new behavior. And it's particularly important if you're trying to break any past habits and so forth. Then it does also go with plan for failure though. And this is how the two link together, because if you muck up, say for instance, you wanted to be healthy and you've ultimately had a bad lunch. You've had like a really unhealthy lunch. So the if-then rule fires off that basically says, well, if I've had a bad lunch, then I'll stop by the store and buy some good veggies and stuff like that, and I'll just make myself a really good dinner. So those two work really well together to plan for failure and particularly use if-then rules. Get a buddy. Obviously, accountability is incredibly important, but also even sharing the journey works well. So if you want to run more, having someone that's meeting you outside your house at 7 o'clock in the morning. Form a new trigger. And so ultimately, I've talked about the photo. Well, the photo didn't used to be there. So you can ultimately, and I talked about cues, and for instance, so you can have your alarm go off. There are ways to install new triggers. You just have to decide what they are. Every time you walk through a doorway, for instance, you could think, I want to be fully present with whoever I'm about to meet. So there's lots of like triggers are everywhere. You get in and out of a car several times a day. You close the door, you hear that sound. Okay, that triggers me to think, I've closed the door. I'm going to be fully present on driving, so that I drive really well. Replace lost needs, and this is where a lot of people fail. They give up. They say, I want to stop eating badly, so I'll just eat better, like eat better food. But ultimately, the food, for instance, was probably feeding some form of need. And this is where the diagram I gave you earlier will help you work out what that reward was that it was giving you. And you need to replace it. If you just cut it cold turkey, your subconscious will sabotage you. It will just go, you're using your willpower tank, and eventually it's going to wear you down. So you do need to replace that lost needs. Be imperfect but consistent. So keeping with that theme, use but. And so what that means is a lot of people have a belief of I'm fat. Okay. And they'll kind of stop there. Like I'm this, I'm that, I'm not good at PowerPoint. Like I'm not good at presenting or whatever. And so they'll kind of stop and they'll use that as a reason to give up on their habit. Where you put but in is it then extends the sentence into I'm not good at presenting, but I know if I get a bit more training, I can be better. And it creates fluid motion. It creates the ability to move forward. And so in the example of I'm fat, but I can be healthier every day. And it unlocks that possibility to move forward. I've talked about remove temptation. So again, if there's lots of things in terms of habits that you might want to break. So just not having them around, having the batteries out of your remote is a great thing. Not having a TV in the bedroom if you wanted to connect with your wife, all these sorts of things, depends on what you want to do. But it's ultimately removing the temptation that would hold you back from that. Associate with role models. If these people are consistently achieving what you want, they're going to take you along for the ride. Run it as an experiment. Ultimately, the reason why that's really effective is it's kind of like being a mad scientist. So when you have a hypothesis, it doesn't have to be right. You don't have to get it perfect. But actually, you're going to see what this new result brings. And so, for instance, sometimes people don't know how to get to their goal. They're just going to try some things along the way to see if it gives them what they're wanting. I've talked about mindfulness earlier, so being the curious detective and just going, okay, well, what's actually going on here and what am I needing out of the situation? Write it down. So this one's really good in terms of habits. It's basically when, where, why, who with, and you want some specific evidence there. And you write it down. And that clarifying process, if you're looking at habits and you're wanting to build a new habit, for instance, well, when are you doing it? Where are you doing it? Who are you doing it with? Why is it important? And so an example would be going to the gym. Well, I'm going to the gym Monday mornings to do the hot yoga class at 9 o'clock. And I'm going with Bev or whatever. But by writing it down, it clarifies all of that thinking that is vague. Like it goes from just the habit of I want to be healthier to being ultra specific and giving you the plan of how to do it. And then you know that there will be pain along the way, but you can increase it. So what I mean by that is you can actually have a consequence for you not achieving your habit. And so an example of that would be you might have to, I know somebody, for instance, at the moment who has a new habit that they're wanting to do, but they have to eat a tin of cat food or actually a bite of cat food. I think it is. I think it wasn't the whole tin if they don't do it. And the funny thing is, for the last 14 days, they've done it. And they've been struggling for a long time before that. And I've heard of other people having to make like donations to like gun bodies and stuff like that, like as in they're anti-guns and that sort of stuff, but I'd have to make it a $50 donation to the National Rifle Association or whatever it is over in America. And so there's a negative consequence to not doing it. And that puts this sometimes a higher stake, because we really don't want to do that thing, to be able to keep doing it. If you do have a relapse, then you do a review. You go, okay, well, what triggered me? What went on, etc. And you take that little detective hat and go, okay, well, how can I do better next time? And then the last one is enjoy the new habit. You'll stick with it longer if you do. If you're trying to build habits that you don't enjoy, then you're setting yourself up to fail. Find a way to make it small, make it fun, give it a little bit of a reward if you can. But ultimately, if you're not enjoying the whole thing, if it's too big, you're unlikely to sustain it. So that's where we'll sign off for habits tonight. Obviously, in terms of the checklist, I'll put that in the Facebook group after the session just now. Before I sign off, any particular questions on habits? We've obviously dived deep, and particularly that last section, we went really tactical between how you can have a structure to, with Charles Duhigg's framework, how to have a structure to be able to change habits, to analyze across the cue, the reward, the routine. And then we've given you 23 ways to be able to install new habits or change and reprogram habits. So any particular questions on what we've covered tonight?
Yeah, where did you get these 23 habits from? Was it like one from one source, one book, or?
No, you can see, I think I've mentioned about 5 books earlier. Habits is a very big section of more. And so what I've done is I've abridged over the last 2 weeks, so around routines and around this, I've abridged some of the research from the book More. And yeah, so basically,
your book.
My book More. Because More deals with the subject of creating more of what matters in your life. Habits, routines is a very big part of how we live our life, how we show up every day. And so, yeah, no, the 23 is basically, when you look at the research, it's ultimately picking, it's about a bit like golf clubs. I basically found every golf club you could use, and that way you can pick whichever one's right for you. So, for instance, if you're looking at habit stacking, well, that's, again, an easy one. If it's just a new behavior you wanting to implement, it's like picking out the 3 iron and you're on the fairway. But if you're, for instance, finding that you keep mucking up, so you're in a sand trap, as an example, you're in a sand trap, you need a sand wedge to get out. Well, that's where, again, running a consequence might work for you, or having a buddy, or having like doing a diagnosis. So I just wanted to give and wanted to be able to create a definitive list of how do people build habits, and ultimately what things work. So it's a consolidation of lots of resources across the books that I mentioned earlier.
Okay, and I've got one more question. So you were talking back a bit about the checklist manifesto and such, and you were saying, when you make a checklist, make sure you don't miss more than 2. So let's just say you wanted to drink a glass of water an hour or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about don't miss more than 2, does that mean don't miss more than 2 days in a row? Don't miss more than 2?
Yeah, I'm mainly talking about don't miss more than 2 days in a row, because ultimately, yeah, a lot of people, when they fall down once, don't get back on the horse. And that's where I'm like, with that 31-day tracker, it's about don't miss more than 2 days in a row. With water, if you're more than 1% dehydrated, your performance is impaired. It's not the end of the world. But yeah, it's ultimately the separate trackers will help with those. And it's about same thing, about being consistent. But yeah, when you say don't miss more than 2, it relates to the 31 days, and just the fact that people will not get back on the horse. They'll be like, oh, I failed, it didn't work, whatever. And, or just been busy. Like that's a big one. Like life's busy. And so they'll let that be a reason as to why they don't get their habit done. And ultimately, if you miss one, got to make it up the next day.
Thanks.
Any other good question? Any other questions? Awesome. Well, have a spectacular evening, and ultimately we'll see you guys on Monday night for our momentum sessions. Have a great weekend, guys.